Welcome to the Homelab Show, episode 72, Out of Band Management and all the options around it. So, yes, we're going to be talking about, because Jay just did a video on it, the tiny pilot, but someone will undoubtedly be mashing the comments going, what about the Pi KVM? Of course, we'll mention that too, which you can believe run that on the same hardware. There's a few projects out there. We may even use just the general word KVM because I know Jay referenced them and realized how expensive they are, but we're going to talk about all the reasons you might want to have this. We figure it's a pretty good home lab topic because some motherboards are going to have it. Those are great. The new ones are expensive, but the workarounds, well, we'll talk about in different methodologies. Before we get into that, a place where you don't necessarily need lights out management, but they have a method to do this is Linode, sponsor of the show. And yeah, they've got a great way you can manage everything and you can upload ISOs there and things like that, build some of your own stuff. Can't you, Jay?
Well, you can DD directly to the instance because you can
Yes.
boot it into Recovery Console. You could actually take an image of your machine and you could even create your own locally and then DD that right up to Linode and run something that's not even on their list.
Yes. Jay's got a few videos on Linode already. They're a great sponsor of the show. If you're listening to the show, it was literally brought to you by Linode. That's where we host all of the WordPress and everything and all the downloads for the show. But we thank them for being a sponsor and play with all their fun stuff they have on there in their marketplace. I have some new videos I'll be doing on Linode as well pretty soon because they've added some more things. Like I believe they recently got their Ubiquiti installer on there for the Unified Controller software. So I'll be excited to play with that. Offer code down below to get started with Linode. And let's jump into today's topic.
Yep.
Lights out. Now, I figure this is definitely related to the home lab, even though a lot of you are probably saying, but my server is an arm's length away, or my server's just in that closet over there, or just downstairs. And yeah, the moment that your server has some issue that goes down, and one of them you can't figure out why because you can't SSH into it, and you're not at home, but you are sitting there remotely with a laptop, you will wish you had this for sure. And
Yep.
I even make sure even any of the lab stuff that we put together, even for my lab, because my lab is physically, well, I live relatively close, but my new studio is at home and my lab is at my office for space reasons. And yeah, it's small things you really want to have is access to the console when something goes wrong. And that's why we figured it's probably a good topic on there. It's also good training and understanding for the things you will very likely run into when you're dealing with enterprise equipment, whether you're managing it, you don't necessarily want to. And even when it is just a room away, it's really convenient to be able to get to the console and get into the BIOS settings when, well, it won't boot. And you want to be able to do that. And you want to do it from your keyboard, nice, comfy spot and remotely. So that's why we picked this topic.
Yep.
Which one should we start with? Probably buying old servers, what to look for on them.
I think that's a good place to start. I'll add something to what you just said too. I just ran into this issue where, I think I solved it. I don't know. It's kind of like Homelab. It's like it hasn't been showing the problem in a while. But what ended up happening is that one of my Proxmox nodes ended up just deciding that it every now and then just wants to drop the 10 gig card. I mean, just it could work all day long, and then usually around 10 at night, a great time for this to happen. All of a sudden, I get a notice that it's off the network, and it's like, what's going on? So this was a situation where I used, in my case, IPMI. I have a few servers that have IPMI and a few that don't. But IPMI allowed me to see right what was on the screen when I couldn't access it, and it, right on the login screen, some text was saying, the card was dropped from the bus, so that would explain why I couldn't access it. So I could access the BIOS, I could reset it or whatever I have to do, or even just in my case, log in when it's not on the network at all because it dropped the card. I could log in, reboot it, and then when it comes back up, check the logs and whatnot. So the and like you were saying, you could have it at an arm's length away, but a lot of us don't. My other server room is so cluttered. I don't even show it on footage at all. And I can't get a monitor in there. If I tried, I would probably trip over something. And, don't be like me. Have a server room that's organized. Anyway, that really helped out for me. But in my case, it's probably a good example as well, because like I mentioned, a few of my servers have IPMI and then, some don't. Some have iDRAC. So I think that's a good example of like what the options are and what the differences are between them. So IPMI, for example, is built into a lot of motherboards. I mean, Supermicro being a good example of that. And
Supermicro,
yep,
ASRock.
yep, you can go right on into a web browser, navigate to the IP address. It's a separate IP address for IPMI than it is for the any cards or the system's NIC that you might have. So you get this IP address, you can log in, and iDRAC is basically the same thing. We're at very high level here. There's a lot of differences, but the use case is the same. In
Yeah.
iDRAC, you log in through a web browser, and that's going to be with Dell servers. Dell PowerEdge servers has that.
iDRAC is
Yep.
specific to Dell, and
Yep.
HP has theirs called ILO. ILO Lights Out
Oh
Management
yeah.
is the one for HP.
Yep. So there's different solutions, and as we're going to explore the solution might be awesome. Like in my case, IPMI, my Supermicro servers, HTML5 requires no plugins. Just go to the IP address, add your or type in your username and password, and that's it. You just navigate the interface. It's pretty straightforward. And again, key here, no plugins. And this is going to be something
Yes,
we'll be talking about. Whereas with iDRAC, whether or not you need a plugin depends on the version of iDRAC that you
and
have,
how
like
old
the
it is.
vintage of your server. So,
Yeah, absolutely. And that error message thing is probably a really important one because you want to know that last message that the server gave before it decided not to respond to network. And losing the network interface on the bus, yeah, we can reboot the server and we probably come back up and running. But that is another convenient feature of the IPMI to go, what did it do? I also like to watch them when I'm doing updates that I know will require a reboot. Zen server, some of the XCPNG, I get to watch it reboot and make sure all those things, or if there's something scrolling by, because if it doesn't get to the boot process, I don't have an option to examine all the logs. But
yep.
we'll start with the Dell ones because this is where I think a lot of Homelabbers start because Dell is really popular in the Homelab market, and your budget will determine what version of iDRAC you get essentially. Now, the good news is
Yeah.
the iDRAC systems on Dell, one, you want to go for the enterprise iDRAC. If you want the full remote control features, when you're looking for use servers, you want to look specifically for the ones with enterprise iDRAC. The other nice advantage you get with the enterprise iDRAC is the most of them, I mean, there may be exceptions to this, majority of them are going to have a dedicated extra interface for it. And you want this because I really strongly believe whether you're using ASRock, whether you're using a Dell, whatever version you're using, make sure that it's on a separate network for security reasons because you don't necessarily want that to be accessible. I'm trying to remember which company it was, but it's been a couple of them that have had some security incidents. There was a few data centers that left massive amounts of their networks where people could pivot to them really easily to the IPMI, and that was actually the source of some
Mhm.
drama for them. So you really want to make sure that these are separate. Your lights out management network is separated in a more physical way, not just a VLAN. I've seen this. We actually did some consulting with a data center recently. We were just going over all their infrastructure, and they said they couldn't get insured unless it was verified that it was all separate. So I thought that was cool. So I was like, okay, great.
Yeah.
They actually said it was part of their insurance policy. Their insurer understood the need for it at the data centers because of the sensitivity of what they host. And so they said it's actually physically separate. It is a independent, separate network that manages anyone's iDRAC, and it's extremely limited who can access it. So following those policies, even if you're building your home lab, makes a lot of sense. Now,
Mhm.
with the Dell Enterprise, one of the nice things about them, and to my knowledge, they still sell them this way. Someone please correct me in the comments if this has changed and I've just been not made aware of it. But all the older ones are all perpetual licenses. I like that a lot because this can be a problem with some companies that have licenses. And I think HP is one of those companies that has confusing licenses attached for things, but the Dell's perpetual. So if you have a fully enabled enterprise iDRAC on a Dell, you get all the features even when it transfers to the next owner. You don't have to
Yep.
re-register it or anything like that. Now, here's what the downside is, like Jay mentioned, the stupid Java thing you have to run.
Oh
Everything
my
was in
gosh.
Java for a long time when they did these. So you had to use, and there's different ways to do it. So one way was to, on Linux, Windows, just load Java and run the little Java applet it downloads. In Linux, there's a plugin called iced T, and that if you type in like iced T Java Linux, is pretty simple. It's usually in most of the repositories. It is for the Ubuntu based distributions. You can run it from there. You have to say yes a lot because it'll have a bunch of applet questions that you just kind of yes your way through it, and then you'll get a less than wonderful but workable screen on those. This was
Yeah.
probably back to the iDRAC 7 series, and I think the earlier 8s. Once you go to the iDRAC 9, it's all HTML5 and simple. I think there is a later version of 8 that offers HTML5, but
Yeah,
yeah,
there was
it's
one that got an update in the firmware, and that's one of the things that's really confusing about iDRAC and why we're probably gonna be talking about this, like, this segment being longer than most because of how confusing it is. So, you could have 2 home labbers that both get a Dell PowerEdge server from eBay or something, and they could have a completely different experience. Like, one person might access the iDRAC, works perfectly fine, no plugins, it's right there in the browser. The other person, like you're saying, there might not be a license for the iDRAC that came with the server, or maybe there is a license for that iDRAC, and like you were saying, you buy that server, it sticks with that iDRAC card. That's pretty cool. But then it could be the older version and they need Java. Now, in my experience, the way that you mentioned how it all plays out, that's correct. That's what you want if you're stuck with an older iDRAC, but you don't want Java at the same time. But
yeah,
the problem for
it can
me
be
is
worked around.
I was not able to get that to work last time I tried it in any browser, even with the plugin. Like, there were so many, like, I said yes to everything for that particular instance in my test, and it was still blocked in the browser. And the browsers at this point are doing everything they can to get, basically just get Java out of the equation. And why is that? Well, you have to understand the slogan for Java. The official slogan is write once, exploit everywhere. That's not what, Java says on the website, but that's what I say the slogan is because it's a play on their write once, run everywhere, isn't it? Or deploy everywhere, something like that. But
Yeah,
it's write once, exploit everywhere because it's a security concern and all these hoops you have to jump through. If you get it working, then is the Java plugin sandboxed, or is it gonna be, like, lowering the security of your entire system?
yes,
Now, this is the problem because depending on the version of iDRAC you get, you may have the HTML5 version or not. You may have a license or not. So look at the if you're buying a server and it just happens to be Dell, you can look at the description. If it's licensed, a lot of times they'll tell you because that's noteworthy. And another option that I recommend if you have one of the older ones that can't be updated. Now, I say recommend, but it's a soft recommendation. It's actually a container. I haven't tried it myself, so keep that in mind. But basically, my understanding is that this is a container image, and you run this container, and it has everything that iDRAC needs inside of it, and it does some kind of a VNC proxy, so you can see, actually see what's going on in the iDRAC without worrying about anything. Because if Java's in the container, and you're only running that container just long enough to get into your iDRAC and do what you have to do, then you shut the container down. There's no security risk at that point. Well, at
right,
least no extra one, depending on how secure the rest of your system is. But
right.
these are some hoops that you have to jump through with iDRAC, which makes iDRAC either really super awesome or incredibly tedious, depending on
How
what you
old it
end up
is.
getting. Yeah.
And I'll add to the confusion here. Someone had posted in the comments, and they are correct. iDRAC 7 does have, because I logged in one of the old servers we have. iDRAC 7 does support HTML5, so I was wrong about how old it is. But where I went to the about page, it says iDRAC 7 at the top. But when you go to the about page, it says version 2.6.1.6.6.0, build '08. So it's kind of strange why it calls it iDRAC 7, but the version number starts 2.6.1. So nonetheless, it
Hmm.
is a HTML5 interface on that one. I know the newer ones are all HTML5, so I guess you can go back to iDRAC 7 and get HTML5. And you can look this up if you're buying one of these servers used on eBay. There's still some good servers that may still have that old Java, but whatever you can, go HTML5. Your life is easier. It works in a browser. By the way, sorry, people who love Firefox, you may find yourself opening some of these in Chrome. There has been some bugs where it just the HTML5 sometimes doesn't work. I don't know if it's a specific version or an older version, but I've seen it not work in some of the Firefox. It's the way it's not specifically Chrome like Google Chrome. It works in Chromium based browsers. You'll run into that with some of these where that seems to be a prerequisite. Not all the time, but you may just of note if it gives you a weird loading error. I've seen that problem on some of them. I don't think it's a Dell one. I think the Dell one works in both Firefox and that, but
Yeah.
nonetheless, that covers a lot of the Dell stuff that you might be looking for on there.
Another comment that I'll make about that is if you get let's just say you get an iDRAC that is HTML5 compatible, or it doesn't even have to be iDRAC, because I noticed this with IPMI, the one that I have. And you log in and it basically says you need the Java plugin. Then you might think, well, wait a minute, this one is supposed to be the one that
Yes.
supports HTML5. Why does it say Java? Well, you'll have an HTML5 button that you can click that's separate from the main one, because they might still have that interface for legacy purposes, but you
They
can just,
default to Java all
yeah,
the time, and I have no idea
right.
why. So yes.
Because an enterprise, where these things came from, I mean, think of how long the enterprise kept Internet Explorer alive, for example.
Yeah.
So these things stick around a while. So they're probably just trying to avoid complaints like, well, I was set up for, or my browser was set up for this, and now it doesn't work. What's going on? So they have that legacy thing in there. Personally, I think legacy should be killed quickly, and whatever company isn't ready for it, it's their fault for not being ready. But that's not a popular opinion, so we'll just pretend I didn't say
And
that. So
it's also it's easier said than done.
right.
So,
It is, yeah. So that's, like you said, that's basically iDRAC. Get the newest version you can for the server model that you're ordering, because even if it's like let's say a R710 or something, there could have been like several different versions of iDRAC sold through the life of that server. So just having that model of server doesn't mean you necessarily have a specific version of iDRAC, because again, there's multiple versions. So get the highest version, check and see if it's licensed from the seller or wherever you're getting it from.
yep.
And if you do all that, you should be fine.
Yeah, you should be good to go on that. So the next one we're talking about is, obviously we mentioned Supermicro a few times. A lot of the Supermicros, I actually think pretty much most all the equipment they make has that option on it. All their server
IPMI.
equipment
Yep.
does. And it's really nice. And the same thing, the older ones are going to have that. So when you're looking for any of the servers with the Supermicro series, check that out. They usually, most of the ones I've seen pretty universally come with a dedicated port for it, which is great. You don't have to worry about trying to, parse that out of one of the other ports, because sometimes they're bound to, if there's two network ports, they'll be bound to one of them and not have the separate, but you can, same thing, they'll have a separate on there. Now, if you want to start with building your own stuff, and it's actually very similar, like it's kind of like how BIOS manufacturers, there's only a few of them. The IPMI and lights out management tools, there's only a few of them out there, because the one that I noticed in the ASRock rack series are also seem to be the same ones that are in the Gigabyte motherboard series that has these as well. And I'll be doing some upcoming videos because we built some new lab servers based on the ASRock rack series X570D4U. There's a link I threw in the description for this particular board. Now, these are really nice. And if you're building a server, it's kind of a price points problem. The price jumps up substantially for these particular boards, but they're the more commercially driven boards. They really work really well, but their lights out management has a lot of conveniences. And this board right here supports specifically the AMD Ryzen series processors. But one of the problems you may run into, and this is kind of a nice thing about being able to do lights out management, if you're doing different or newer generation processors that maybe the BIOS doesn't have support for, you can even get all your BIOS updates and everything set up for these. So it actually added some convenience. We had to do some BIOS updating when we first got this. There was a couple little things that we were having problems with. I have notes on it that I won't get into here, but nonetheless, you can buy these boards with lights out management for, I don't think, a completely unreasonable price. This board is roughly in the $400 range. There's some that are a little bit cheaper, but if you're building something new, you can build something that has all this lights out management feature on there. I know it's an investment if you're building it in your home lab, but if you're looking at new boards, I would definitely steer towards these. They add all the conveniences that we talked about at the beginning for getting things done and managing remotely. So yeah, check those out. There's plenty of manufacturers that have it on there. And once you don't have to plug in or use video on it at all, life just gets simpler, because we actually are building, well, we built 3 of them. And so we just, set them all up on a separate network for management. I can see the screens of all of them. You can load them. Now, to go further, they have the ability to add media to these. And the newer Dells have this ability. Well, you can actually attach ISOs to them and actually set up your installers. This is really convenient because now, without popping in a USB to reload it, you can completely remotely reload the operating system, reconfigure it, and get things going on it without ever having to come and physically touch it. This is actually used in the data center level a lot, where they'll have, maybe a local storage server, because some of them will allow you to mount SMB shares and maybe have an ISO set up with a series of SMB shares, or sometimes you can just direct attach them if you know the operating system you're going to be loading. And if there's ever a problem with the machine, you have complete remote access to get it restored, get it done. And of course, you can put bootable USBs in these and leave them in there and use them for that use case where you have the OS flashed on a USB. You just don't set it to the boot device. But hey, if something goes wrong, you can go in, reconfigure it, reload. The conveniences are stellar for being able to do that and have it on there.
Yeah,
So
but you have to tell your admins about that, because I remember earlier in my career, I ran into a situation where I had somebody I was, talking to over the phone and walking them through doing, fixing something for the company server. And I rebooted the machine and he's like, it's booting into Windows setup. I'm like, what?
yeah,
How? Like, is there a USB key somewhere? No. What? What do you mean there's no USB key? How is it booting into Windows setup? If it, like, is there a DVD drive? Yeah. Is there a disk in there? No. Oh, and that's
maybe.
when I discovered that there's you know where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
And that's where I discovered that some of these servers actually have a USB port on the motherboard, and some
Yes.
admins will actually put the OS installer right on it. Probably shouldn't make that the first boot choice though, just saying. That's a little unusual, but yeah, that's actually very common, and I found out the hard way. We spent a good amount of time trying to figure out why Windows setup kept coming up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you look, even the Supermicro that see, Xavier joined us here. That's one of the things that like the Supermicro that Jay's using. It's got the USBs internally. These are common for a lot of them, but it's also something you can set up if you're going to do this for a business and you don't necessarily want to drive out there, but hey, things go wrong, something went completely haywire, at least you can get some of the reload process and things started that way. Maybe even
Mhm.
do a recovery if you have images you can send on there. Having all that remote access in there is really handy. Now let's move on to what happens when you don't, and what about these fancy Rotarian KVMs? I think you had brought those up in your recent Tiny
Yeah.
Pilot video.
Yep.
I don't really understand why. Maybe it's just a mass manufacturing problem. Even used, when you look at some of the IP-based KVMs, they're expensive. They are genuinely, I think used, the one you pulled up was in the $1,800 range. Does that sound right,
It
Jay?
was, yeah, and it's kind of funny when when I put that in the video, because then Veronica, who our audience might know from Veronica Explains, messaged me, and apparently that person, that random eBay post was near her hometown, and I think she might even know the resellers actually that are putting that on eBay. What are the odds? But yeah, they are very expensive, and I've never known how to pronounce that. I hope I pronounced it right in the video. I said Raritan or Raritan. It's
Yeah,
just,
Raritan. I think maybe yeah, there's an I before it, so it's Raritan.
we're probably both wrong at the end of the day, honestly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are some pretty pricey KVM systems. It, it's one of those things that a lot of people ask about it, and it's a common question. And they go, where can I get a cheap one? And the most popular brand that I'm aware of is those. And they're really slick the way they work. They're essentially like a rack-mounted 1U appliance, and then they're going to use the network as a transport to be able to connect to it. I really wanted to build these when we started setting up our office for when we did a lot more retail computer repair, but it became impractical from the price standpoint. I couldn't believe how much they wanted. But we're not saying not to do it. We're saying there's another solution. And
Mhm.
that video Jay did. Now, there's more than one project based around this. You have the Tiny Pilot project, which is not really a project, more of a product. The difference is it's still based on a lot of the open source stuff. It's still based on Raspberry Pi, but they sell it as a complete go ahead and get started kit. Then you have the Pi KVM. That's just a big DIY kit with a GitHub link to lots of the ways you find the parts and assemble it. So either one of those are good, and they're both based on Raspberry Pi. It kind of depends on, do you want to assemble it and put it together yourself? That's a fun project. Probably a lot of Homelab people might lean that way. Or do you just want one out of the box that works, that has an update process and everything to set it up? But either one of these are good solutions for any existing board. But how much was that Tiny Pilot?
Yeah, I think it was $359.99 US dollars, and then PoE, the version I reviewed had that extra. But what I really liked about it, I mentioned this in the video, obviously people are gonna say, "Hey, that's a lot of money. I can't really, why are you just blindly recommending this thing that's nearly $400?" And that's true, right? Because not all of us have money to spend on these things. But then that same company on their website has a blog post where they say, here's how you just make one of your own for less than $100, which tells me, the home lab mindset works out really well. Because if you just so happen to have a Raspberry Pi lying around, because, God forbid, trying to actually find one right now, and you don't have anything in mind to use it for, you could look at that blog post and find out what extra components you might need. For example, you might need a HDMI to VGA adapter, which you'll need one that's USB powered. They have that on the site there. You might only need a few extra things. And if you have access to a 3D printer, even better, because then you could print a case for it. And then for less than $100, or way less than $100, if you already have a Raspberry Pi, then essentially for $40, $50 or so, you have a whole solution around
Right.
that.
But this is where, one of the cool things I think someone asked this question in your video. I don't know if you responded to it yet, but they asked, could you take the Pi KVM and hook it up to which KVMs? And we actually tested this as I did a review of the Tiny Pilot as well. And we did some testing with this, and you can find some lists that have been maintained of like 8-port KVM switches that work with the Pi KVM. So what this allows you to do is make it really easy. You got 8 computers or more you want to, or, I would say 8 because it's an 8-port one. But you have like a few computers you want to hook up, you buy one Pi KVM, set it up, configure it, and it talks to a generic, like you would sit in front of it type KVM. And they have the instructions of how to set up to switch between all the different systems on there. So take that, Rotarian, because you can buy those 8-port ones used for relatively cheap. And now you've got your IP KVM solution at a home lab affordable price. It's a little bit. So there are solutions and workarounds out there. There is a list, though. You just Google multi-port KVM over. It's on the Pi KVM docs. They maintain a whole list of it over there. And because Pi KVM is so similar to the Tiny Pilot, I believe that any of those, I can't guarantee them till you test them, but they should work. The little bit of limited testing we did, we didn't have a problem getting our Tiny Pilot working with a couple small KVMs we had laying around the office. You just have to make sure that the key presses, whatever those are, the sequence of them will go through the Pi KVM, because some of the KVMs will only let you press buttons. Well, obviously that's not working because you're not able to press buttons on
Right.
there physically. But nonetheless, it's another workaround solution for to get that going.
And since the first time I reviewed the Tiny Pilot, because the new one, was a new review. I reviewed it before, when it first came out, I think, or near the time it first came out. And since then, they added the ability to boot from an ISO image. You can actually upload an ISO image to the Tiny Pilot. And
Yes.
then what happens is you go into the BIOS, you choose the boot order. You can actually set the Tiny Pilot itself as the first boot option. So if you have an ISO mounted, it'll just boot into that, and you can do that. I mentioned power over Ethernet. Now, this is way overkill, but as you're talking about the 8-port KVM or HDMI, or what was that, like an attachment or a HDMI splitter that was 8-port that you put
Yeah.
on the KVM?
Yeah.
So basically, the one idea I had, again, this is overkill, is getting a server chassis, mounting the Raspberry Pi inside, mounting that inside, and then terminating the ends at the end, and just have a whole rack mount solution that's based on Raspberry Pi. Again, overkill, completely unnecessary. But sometimes overkill and unnecessary is the most attractive to us because it's just so cool. And you could have like a whole Raritan equivalent that is rack mounted based on Raspberry Pi with the ability to have multiple servers, and it'll still cost you less than, even with the inflated Raspberry Pi prices, probably still will cost you less than the actual Raritan. And something that you made. How cool would that be? If anyone does that, please send us photos, okay? Because that'd be
Absolutely.
so cool to see. But you could absolutely do it because us home labbers, we're creative. We love to build things, and so I think if you're a home labber, it's either build your own or just use any parts you might have to build your own if you have the parts. And if you could find a Raspberry Pi if you don't already have one. But if that's not you and you are a business and you need a turnkey solution, you could just order the already made version of that, which I suspect businesses would be like the biggest customer for that $350 version, whereas people like us were probably reading that article that says, "Here's how to build it for under $100." That's probably what we're going to be doing.
Yeah. And I'm positive if you have the Raspberry Pi laying around and you just need the couple extra accessories. So
Yeah, it's a moment you've been training for.
absolutely. I think that's all we have for all the lights out management. It's not a deep topic, but it's a topic I thought worth covering
Yep.
because of some of those ideas on there. I made sure I updated the description to include Jay's Tiny Pilot video. I
Mhm.
also included the link for those of you that want to know which KVM switches work with the Pi KVM. So you can look at those. And the nice thing is the ones we list are not like brand new ones. They're actually some older generic ones that I'm positive you can find on eBay for a pretty cheap price. Actually, I'm gonna look at one. And well, they're bonus is they're even HDMI ones, which is kind of cool. So what does this one
Yeah,
go
that is
for on
really
eBay?
cool too. Yeah.
Yeah,
A lot of the servers will most likely have VGA because of the age of the server, but, that's nothing that a VGA adapter can't solve pretty easily anyway, so
yeah. There's like one of the ones listed is the looks like it's called Test Smart 8 port and $115 going on eBay right now. Buy it now. So that's you buy that in a Pi KVM, you're building a pretty robust solution for your home lab for a pretty reasonable budget, provided you actually need it and you don't have a home lab with a bunch of displays on it. So if you already have the home lab and you've already built everything with a bunch of old Dells and you get the iDRAC Enterprise, well, that's the other solution we talked about first. So
I I could I was kind of reminded strangely of, I used to have a computer repair business a long time ago. It was a lot of fun, I really enjoyed it, and I was just kinda thinking, like, if back then we had something like the Tiny Pilot, how much easier would it be for a computer repair shop? Again, a business can afford this. This isn't something a home lab could do, but if you work for a repair shop, you might like this idea. Getting, like, I don't know, anywhere from 5 to 10, KVMs, Tiny Pilots, and then just instead of having, like, a monitor, like a, manual KVM switch, you could just, line the customer's computers up that you're fixing and then have each one on a on a KVM, and then just from one workstation, you could just multitask and fix all the computers in one shot. You don't even have to, you could
yeah,
have a lot smaller of space there. I mean, there's so many use cases. I don't think you could get away with playing a Nintendo Switch off of a Tiny Pilot. It would absolutely show it, but I don't think that would work. But there's probably a lot of clever use cases that I'm
yeah.
not thinking
And we
about.
we had that we have a 8 port. We still had it's still actually at my office when we did retail computer repair.
Mhm.
We had an 8 port so one tech could work on 8 machines. We had a pair of them. So each tech was able to swap between 8 machines, mostly because loading them has become easier and less the problem. We just load our remote control tool on each one of them. So one tech can sit in his office and now control many of them that are in even when they're in the office, they still use it. Because I think someone said it earlier, the best sysadmins never leave their desk.
Yeah, I saw that comment come up too, and I thought that was a great one because it is true because we're efficient. We don't wanna run back and forth
Right.
any more than we have to because that's a waste of time, let's be honest, especially if you are an IT employee at a really large campus where you have to walk from one building to the next constantly to fix people's computers. It's probably better just to have remote access to make it more efficient for sure.
Wait, are you saying, Jay, there's a chance that all this automation is making IT people less healthy and sit at their desks more? Is this related?
Well, mental health or physical health, both are
Oh,
important, but I always argue that mental health is more important because, a lot more bad can happen as a result of that. So if you're taking care of your mental health at the very least, I think you're probably good, and I don't think mental health is really best served by, a
yeah,
waste of time
and
over and
and
over and over again.
yeah, but you get a breath of fresh air walking across the
That's
campus
that's
to to
true.
to then go find yourself aggravated that someone didn't plug something in, but that's a whole different topic. Tales from tech support we could commiserate about forever. But
Yep.
thank you for joining us. Links are down below. And, I think someone just mentioned too, Jeff Geerling did a video recently about this, a KVM on it. I seen a video come up. I did not watch it yet, but we talk to Jeff all the time. He's a good friend of me and
Mhm.
Jay's.
Yep.
Yes, he did it with a compute module on there. So I will go watch that video as well. Obviously, Jeff Geerling videos are always like just a source of entertainment and education all combined into one. So
Oh,
definitely a
yeah.
good friend of the show here. One day when Jeff has a few extra minutes that we can squeeze out of him, we would love to have him as a guest because he
Yeah.
is the Raspberry Pi King. That is for sure.
Yeah, we'll be definitely trying. I mean, his is one of my favorite YouTube channels.
Oh yeah.
And he puts so much work into his videos that's the reason why he doesn't have time to come on here because the
Yeah.
amount of work that goes into every video that he does, it's almost like you take any of the super advanced videos that I do and just imagine that being every single video. Poor guy. But hopefully we can get him on the show. That'd be
Yep.
really cool to do.
All right. Send your feedback over to our website. There is a spot where you can fill out the form feedback. That's where you get to ask those questions that we cover first when we do our Q&A episodes. Looking forward to hearing from you. Tag us in a tweet if you built something crazy too. That's always, me and Jay love seeing all the different home
Oh
lab
yeah.
things and the wild ideas people come up with. So definitely always a lot of fun, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.